I was born into a house where loyalty meant silence and silence meant safety, or at least the illusion of it, and where every laugh from my sister seemed to buy her another ounce of freedom while every word I spoke felt like a trespass I could never take back. Our home in Springfield, Illinois was a modest two-story on a quiet street lined with maples and gossip, but inside it was a place where the rules bent toward her and away from me. My sister Angela had hair like a shampoo commercial and a laugh my parents treated like currency. She was the face they showed the neighbors at barbecues, the reason they joined the country club, and the star of every Christmas card. She learned early that charm was a weapon and that in our house she was allowed to wield it without consequence. My father Frank believed in control, the kind that could be mistaken for order from the outside. He was the sort of man who kept his shoes polished even on weekends and his voice level when strangers were around, but whose eyes would sharpen in an instant if he felt slighted. My mother Lynn played the role of peacekeeper, smoothing over his temper with soft words and softer lies. They called it keeping the family together, but what it meant for me was learning to move quietly, learning to shrink in hallways, learning to nod even when my gut twisted against it. I was 6 the first time I realized there were 2 sets of rules, one for Angela and one for me. She had knocked over a vase while chasing our cat through the living room, the crash shattering the afternoon calm. When my father came in from the garage, she pointed at me without missing a beat and said I bumped it. He looked at her clean face, then at my small hands, and told me to apologize. I did. He told me to pick up the pieces. I did. When I was 8, I found a $20 bill in the pocket of my coat and thought I had won a small fortune. Angela saw it and told me it was hers. I said it wasn't. My father's voice cut through the air like a whip. Don't talk back to your sister. He took the bill from me, handed it to her, and told me to be grateful for family. I learned then that talking back was the gravest sin in our home. At school, I was quiet and studious, drawn to the order of numbers and the way math could be solved with patience and logic. I stayed late for library club. I helped teachers straighten their classrooms. I built a small world where my worth was measured by effort, not approval. Angela built a different world, one of school dances and fast friends and late-night phone calls. When she missed curfew, my mother told my father that it was because she was young and needed freedom. When I was late from staying after to finish a project, I was grounded for a week. The punishments were uneven but consistent enough that I knew not to question them. My father never hit Angela, not once that I saw, but his hands were quick with me. A slap for leaving the porch light on, a shove for muttering under my breath a backhand when I dared to say she had taken something of mine. Each blow taught me that my place in the family was not to be right, but to be quiet. The summer before high school, Angela dented the family car while joyriding with friends. My father spent the afternoon fixing it in the driveway while she brought him lemonade and jokes. The same summer, I spilled juice on the kitchen floor, and before I could grab a towel, he grabbed my arm, twisted it until I yelped, and told me I'd better learn some respect. I wore long sleeves for a week in July to hide the bruise from my friends. By then, I had stopped expecting fairness. I stopped expecting protection. What I learned instead was how to remember every detail, the exact date, the words, the smell of the garage, or the hum of the refrigerator in the background, because I thought one day I might need those details. I learned to bank my anger like coals, because sometimes coals stay hot long after the flames have gone. My father thought obedience was the same as love. He thought fear was the same as respect. My mother thought her silence was the same as keeping the peace. And Angela thought the world would always work the way our household did, bending to her whims. I didn't have the power to prove them wrong then, but I was already making plans to leave the moment I could, and I was already learning how to carry my own truth, even if I had to do it in whispers. High school was where the gap between us became a canyon wide enough for everyone to see, and yet no one seemed to name it out loud. I joined the debate team in the math club and spent weekends working at the public library shelving books and tutoring kids in algebra. Every dollar I earned went into a battered coffee tin hidden under my bed, and every A on my report card was another brick in the wall I was building between me and the house I grew up in. Angela drifted through those years on charm and excuses, skipping classes for shopping trips, lying about study sessions that were really parties, and coming home smelling of perfume and cheap vodka. When her grades sank to C's and D's, my parents shrugged and said school wasn't everything. When mine dipped from an A to a B+ after midterms, my father lectured me about focus and sacrifice and warned me that the world didn't have patience for slackers. The first real explosion happened junior year when I got an academic award from the state. The ceremony was in the school auditorium packed with parents and teachers. I stood on stage clutching the plaque, my hands sweating with pride. My father shook my hand for the photographers, but when we got home, he barely mentioned it, instead turning to Angela to ask about her cheerleading routine. She had quit the squad 2 weeks earlier, but she made up a story about an upcoming performance, and he nodded along as if she were describing the Olympics. I remember sitting there with my plaque on my lap, feeling invisible in my own living room. That spring, I caught her in my room rifling through my desk. She had taken a 50 from my wallet. I told her to put it back. She smirked and walked toward the door. I said I was serious. She turned and said, "Try and make me." My voice rose. I told her she was a thief. My father came in, heard the last word, and without asking anything slapped me so hard my ears rang. "Don't talk back to your sister," he said, and ordered me to apologize. I didn't. He grabbed my arm, shoved me into the wall, and told me again. I tasted blood and refused. That earned me 3 more blows before I muttered the apology he wanted. My mother stood in the doorway, arms folded, eyes on the floor. That was the night I decided college would be my escape. I poured myself into applications and essays, writing late at night when the house was finally quiet. I applied for scholarships because I knew I could never count on them to help me financially. The day I got my acceptance letter from the University of Illinois with a full ride, I thought maybe they would see me differently. I came into the kitchen holding the envelope ready to share the news. My father was reading the paper, my mother was chopping onions, and Angela was scrolling through her phone. "I said I got in." My mother smiled faintly, said, "That's nice, dear," and asked Angela if she wanted to go shopping later. My father grunted, "Good job, kid," then went back to the sports section. Angela didn't even look up. I took the letter back to my room and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the black print until the words blurred. That night, lying awake, I promised myself that the next time I left this house, it would be for good. I didn't care if they noticed or if they missed me. What I cared about was building a life where my worth wasn't measured against my sister's whims and where my voice didn't come with a cost in blood. Every argument, every slap, every time I was told to stay quiet had been teaching me something they didn't mean to teach. They were showing me exactly what I never wanted to be and exactly how far I would go to make sure I wasn't trapped in their rules forever. Leaving for college felt like stepping out of a shadow I had lived in so long, I forgot there was sun beyond it. The University of Illinois campus was sprawling and alive with students hurrying to classes in hoodies and backpacks, and the air smelled like coffee and fresh starts. I moved into a small dorm room with a girl named Rachel who had a laugh that came easy and a habit of leaving sticky notes with encouragement on my desk. For the first time in my life, I could close a door and lock it. I could speak without bracing for a slap. I worked part-time at the campus bookstore and picked up tutoring jobs on the side, saving whatever I could in a new account with my name alone on it. My parents called often at first, mostly to talk about Angela and her new adventures, which included a boyfriend with a shiny car and a taste for expensive restaurants. They never asked about my classes unless it was to remind me that law degrees were hard to get and maybe I should consider something easier. Once my mother called to ask if I could send Angela a little money since she was between jobs. I told her no. The silence on the line was heavy before she said that families should help each other. I reminded her Angela had a family who had been helping her all along. The calls became less frequent after that. On breaks when I came home, the atmosphere was always tense. My father would look me over as if to find evidence that college was changing me in ways he didn't approve of. Angela treated me like a guest in what she called her house, now that she was living there rent-free. Once I came back to find she had been in my old bedroom going through my things. I told her to stop, and she laughed, said "You're not here anymore," and walked out. I started keeping my visits short sometimes, just long enough to have dinner with a friend from high school before driving back to campus. By junior year, I had moved into a small off-campus apartment paid for with my savings from work and a scholarship stipend. It was mine in a way nothing in my parents' house had ever been. I bought a used desk from a thrift store and set it by the window where the afternoon light fell warm across my notebooks. I painted the walls a soft green and filled the shelves with books and plants. On weekends, I explored the city with friends or stayed in to read without anyone demanding I run errands for them. My parents didn't visit. Angela never called unless she wanted something. The distance was a relief, but also a reminder that no matter how far I went, the patterns at home had carved themselves into me. I still startled at sudden noises. I still measured my words when someone's tone sharpened. I still felt that reflex to defend Angela even when she wasn't around, just because it had been my job for so long. But each semester I felt those reflexes dulling a little more. I was learning who I was without their hands shaping me, and I liked the person I was meeting. The summer before my final year, I got an internship at a small but respected law office downtown. The work was demanding, but it was the kind of challenge I thrived on. My supervisor noticed my attention to detail and my ability to stay calm when clients were upset. I realized those skills had been forged in my parents' living room, where calm was the only way to survive. For the first time, I saw something good in the scars I carried. They were proof I had endured and that endurance was worth something here in this world I was building for myself. By the time graduation approached, I had secured a full-time offer from the law office where I interned and signed the lease on a modest one-bedroom apartment in a quieter part of town with tree-lined streets and a bakery on the corner that opened at 6 each morning. Moving in felt like crossing an invisible threshold between who I had been and who I was becoming. I furnished it slowly, starting with a thrifted couch and a second-hand dining table and saving up for a reliable used car so I could commute without relying on buses. The car was a silver sedan, nothing flashy but dependable, and mine entirely paid for with money I earned. I remember driving it home from the lot with the windows down, the smell of clean upholstery mixing with summer air, and thinking, no one could take this from me. Work was intense but satisfying, and my supervisor began trusting me with more responsibility, drafting contracts, meeting clients, and occasionally standing in during small claims hearings. Each paycheck brought me closer to the security I had dreamed of as a teenager, hiding money in a coffee tin. I started making weekend trips with friends, hiking in nearby parks or visiting museums, and I began to feel what it was like to live without the constant undercurrent of tension that had been normal in my parents' house. My parents knew about my job and my apartment, but their reactions were muted. My mother once asked if I was eating enough and then shifted to talking about Angela's latest hairstyle. My father rarely called unless it was to ask if I had heard from Angela or to pass along some errand he thought I could handle for them. Angela herself had not changed much. She drifted between part-time jobs and boyfriends, posting curated slices of her life online and visiting my parents whenever she needed money or a place to stay. One Friday evening, as I was unpacking groceries, my phone lit up with her name. She said she was in town and wanted to see my new place. Against my better judgment, I agreed, thinking maybe things could be different now that we were older. She arrived in a swirl of perfume and shopping bags, looked around with a faint smirk, and said it was cute in a way that made it clear she didn't mean it. I made tea and tried to keep the conversation light, but she kept steering it toward how much better her life would be if she had a car like mine. When I didn't take the hint, she asked outright if she could borrow it for the weekend. I said no. She pouted, accused me of not caring about family, and left in a huff. The next time I heard from her was through my mother, who called to say Angela had been having a hard time and maybe I should help her out more. I reminded her that I had my own bills and responsibilities. She sighed, said I was turning cold, and hung up. It was a familiar dance, the guilt, the demands, the implication that I owed them for existing. But the difference now was that I had a door they couldn't open without my permission and a life they couldn't control unless I let them. That knowledge was a quiet, steady thing in my chest, something that would matter more than I knew when the next storm came. It was almost a year later when I decided to invite them over for dinner, thinking maybe enough time had passed for a civil evening. I cooked roast chicken with rosemary potatoes and set the table with the best I had, candles flickering in their holders and soft jazz playing low in the background. When the knock came, I opened the door to see my father looking around as if measuring the place for flaws, my mother carrying a pie she said Angela had baked, and Angela herself in heels that clicked across my hardwood floor like a metronome. She glanced at the living room and said, "You've done well for yourself," in a tone that suggested surprise I was capable of it. We sat down, and for a while the conversation stayed polite. My mother asking about work, my father nodding vaguely, Angela scrolling on her phone between bites. I poured wine and tried to share a story about a case I had helped resolve at the office, something I was proud of, but before I could finish, Angela launched into a dramatic account of how her latest boyfriend had wronged her and how exhausting it was to deal with men who didn't understand her worth. My father leaned forward, telling her she deserved better, and my mother reached to refill her glass. I stayed quiet, letting her have the floor until she veered into complaining about how I had refused to lend her my car last year. She called me selfish in that teasing way meant to sting under the guise of humor. I told her I worked hard for what I had, and I didn't owe it to anyone to hand over my things. She rolled her eyes and said maybe if I learned to be more generous, I'd have more people who cared about me. I felt the old heat rise in my chest, and before I could stop myself, I said, maybe if you learned to take care of yourself, you wouldn't be living off our parents at 30. The room went still, except for the low hiss of the oven. My father's chair scraped back and his eyes locked on mine with that cold glint I remembered too well. He said, "Watch your mouth," and I said I was telling the truth. That was all it took. He stood, rounded the table, and before I could step back, his fist connected with my cheek, sending me against the wall. The world tilted and my hands flew up, but he kept coming, a shove to my shoulder that slammed me into the corner, another blow to my ribs that knocked the air out of me. My mother shouted his name, but didn't move, and Angela sat frozen with her wine glass halfway to her lips. I gasped and told him to stop tasting blood as my vision swam. He growled that no one talks to his daughter like that, meaning Angela, as if I were some stranger trespassing in their home. My knees buckled and I slid to the floor, the tile cool against my cheek, and he stood over me, breathing hard. The silence that followed was worse than the blows, the soundless agreement from my mother's stillness and Angela's refusal to look at me. In that moment, I knew whatever tie I still had to them had just been severed. I pushed myself up slowly, holding my side, and told them all to get out. My father sneered, but stepped back, muttering about how I'd regret this. My mother guided him toward the door, Angela trailing behind, and the latch clicked shut, leaving me alone in the wreckage of a night I had hoped might heal something. Instead, it had torn the last piece of family I thought I could salvage. When the door closed, I stayed on the floor for a long time, my breath coming in shallow pulls, while the throb in my ribs spread like a bruise blooming under the skin. The metallic tang of blood coated my tongue, and my cheek ached where his fist had landed. I thought about getting up and washing my face, but the weight of everything held me still. Eventually, I reached for my phone and called a rideshare to take me to the ER because driving myself was out of the question. The nurse at intake took one look at me, and her expression shifted to something hard and professional. She asked what happened, and I heard myself say I fell the old reflex to protect him still stronger than I wanted to admit. She didn't push right away, but as she cleaned the split in my lip and examined my side, she said softly, "Falls don't usually leave fingerprints." The X-rays confirmed what I already suspected: 2 cracked ribs, a concussion from hitting the wall, deep contusions on my shoulder and cheek. When the doctor came in, he said these aren't consistent with a simple accident. "Are you sure you don't want to talk to someone?" I thought of the years of silence, the way every attempt to stand up for myself had been met with punishment, and I realized I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the pain in my body. I asked the nurse what would happen if I filed a report. She explained the process, the photos they would take, the statement I would give, the possibility of charges. For the first time in my life, the idea of holding him accountable didn't feel impossible. It felt necessary. She stepped out and returned with an officer who introduced himself quietly and asked if I wanted to make a statement. My hands shook as I agreed. I told him about the dinner, about the words exchanged, about the blows that followed. I told him it wasn't the first time. He asked if there had been witnesses, and I gave him my mother's and Angela's names, knowing they wouldn't back me, but knowing, too, that their silence would say as much as any testimony. He photographed the injuries and took copies of the medical reports. When they left, I sat on the edge of the hospital bed, staring at the white floor tiles and feeling the shape of a decision settling inside me. I couldn't undo the years behind me, but I could decide how the next years would go, and they would not go like this. My co-worker Marlene came to pick me up and drive me home, and when she saw my face, she didn't pretend it was nothing. She helped me inside, made tea, and told me that sometimes you have to stop worrying about the family you're born into and start building the family you choose. That night, lying in bed with my ribs strapped and my head pounding, I thought about what she said and decided I was done protecting him from the truth. I was done protecting all of them. The next morning, I called a lawyer whose card I had kept from a pro bono clinic we once hosted at work. I made an appointment for that afternoon, and when I sat in his office describing everything I realized, I remembered it all in perfect detail: the dates, the words, the times, the smell of the room, the way the air felt before the first blow landed. He listened without interrupting and then laid out the steps we could take to file for charges of assault and battery and to seek a protective order. I agreed to all of it. We began gathering everything we would need: the medical reports, the officer's statement, copies of texts from my mother asking me to let it go, even a voicemail from Angela complaining I was making things difficult. Each piece was another brick in the wall I was building between me and them, this time not to keep me in but to keep them out forever. In the weeks that followed, the case began to take shape like a structure I had been sketching in my head for years without realizing it. My lawyer filed the petition for a protective order and the criminal charges, and the court set a hearing date. I spent my evenings organizing the evidence into binders, each section labeled with dates and incidents, the photographs of my bruises slipped into clear sleeves that made them feel like exhibits in a museum of everything I had endured. Marlene and another coworker, James, agreed to testify about my condition the day after the assault. How I could barely lift my arm to reach the copier. How I winced each time I turned in my chair. The police report included the nurse's statement about the injuries not matching an accident, and the x-rays spoke louder than any words could. My lawyer explained that my father would likely deny everything and try to paint me as ungrateful or unstable, and I told him I had no illusions about that. Angela had already blocked me on social media, and my mother left a single voicemail saying we could still fix this if I dropped it. I didn't respond. Instead, I focused on preparing myself for the courtroom, rehearsing answers to potential questions, reminding myself to keep my voice steady no matter what was said. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed in a simple navy suit and pulled my hair back, looking in the mirror and seeing someone I barely recognized, someone who had chosen to stand instead of bow. The courthouse was cool and smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. My lawyer met me at the entrance, and we walked together to the assigned room where rows of benches faced the judge's bench like pews in a church of judgment. My father was already there, sitting at the defense table, Angela behind him. My mother on the other side, looking anywhere but at me. He wore a suit I had never seen, probably borrowed, and his expression was the same one he used when haggling with a neighbor over a lawnmower, confident and dismissive. The judge entered, and the room rose, then sat. My lawyer presented the case methodically, introducing each piece of evidence, calling the nurse to testify, showing the x-rays on a monitor. I sat still, hands clasped, listening as the facts stacked up like stones. When it was the defense's turn, my father leaned into the microphone and called me a liar. He said I had always been dramatic, that I was trying to punish him for raising me with discipline. He said I had disrespected my sister in her own home, and that any contact we had was minimal and harmless. His attorney tried to cast doubt on the nurse's assessment, suggested the injuries could have happened in other ways. But each time the evidence was there, unflinching. Then came my turn to speak. I walked to the stand, placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and looked at the judge as I recounted the night of the dinner. I described the table, the words exchanged the moment he stood, the first blow, the way the room tilted. I spoke about the years before, the pattern of control and violence, the warnings not to talk back to Angela, the times I had hidden bruises under long sleeves. My voice didn't shake, and when I finished, I felt something in my chest loosen. My father muttered something to his lawyer, louder, now his face flushing red. The judge asked for order. He ignored it, turning to point at me, his words tripping over themselves until they slurred, and in that instant I saw the shift. The flush deepened. His hand went to the edge of the table, his mouth drooped on one side. It happened so fast and yet felt slow, the way a final act does when you realize it's ending exactly as it was always going to. His eyes widened as if trying to force the words out, but the sounds came tangled and broken, a garbled protest that melted into a gasp. He clutched at the table, his knuckles whitening, then staggered a half step before his knees buckled. For a moment, no one moved. The air in the courtroom pulled taut like a wire, and then the bailiff was rushing forward and the judge was calling for medics. Angela stood abruptly, her chair scraping back, and called his name with a pitch I had never heard from her before, half panic and half disbelief. My mother finally turned to look at me as though the blame might somehow transfer through eye contact, but I kept my gaze steady, hands folded in my lap. The paramedics arrived with brisk efficiency, their radios crackling as they assessed him where he lay on the carpet between the tables. They asked about his medical history. Someone said stroke, and I watched the lead medic nod grimly. They lifted him onto a gurney, strapped him in, and wheeled him toward the door, the sound of the wheels over the tile loud in the silence. The judge recessed the hearing, and people began to shuffle out, whispering in low voices, some glancing at me as if trying to read whether I felt triumph or guilt. The truth was, I felt neither. What I felt was an odd kind of stillness, the quiet after a storm, when you realize the roof is still over your head and you are still standing. My lawyer touched my arm lightly and said we would reconvene once he was stable enough for the case to proceed, but that the evidence already spoke volumes. Angela brushed past me in the aisle, her perfume sharp and cloying, muttering that I had gone too far. I didn't answer. Outside, on the courthouse steps, the midday sun hit my face, and I realized I was breathing more easily than I had in weeks. The crowd dispersed quickly, reporters drifting toward other stories, and I walked to my car without looking back. Over the next few days, updates trickled in. He had suffered a significant stroke, partial paralysis on one side, speech impaired. He would need months of rehabilitation and might never return to his old strength. The hearing was rescheduled, and when it resumed, he was wheeled in by an aide, thinner, paler, a shadow of the man who once towered over me in fury. The judge ruled in my favor, granting the protective order and ordering him to cover my medical expenses and legal fees. It wasn't jail time, but it was a public acknowledgement that what he had done was wrong, and that mattered. My mother avoided my eyes as they left the courtroom, Angela pushing the wheelchair without a word. I knew then that whatever bond had existed between us was gone, and I felt lighter for it. In the weeks after the ruling, I began to feel the shape of my life shift into something that belonged entirely to me. The protective order meant I could walk into my apartment without glancing over my shoulder or wondering if a knock on the door would drag me back into the cycle I had fought so hard to break. At work, my colleagues treated me with a quiet respect, never prying, but always ready with support, and Marlene made a habit of inviting me to Friday dinners with her family, where laughter came easily, and no one raised their voice to be heard. The settlement money covered the hospital bills and left enough to replace the furniture that had been damaged the night of the assault, and I bought a new bed with a frame sturdy enough to feel like permanence. I started physical therapy for my ribs and took slow walks around the park near my building, feeling my strength return one step at a time. Angela sent one text 2 months later, a single line that read, "You didn't have to destroy everything." I stared at it for a long moment before deleting it without replying. My mother never called. News from extended relatives trickled in through cousins who told me my father was struggling with therapy and that the house felt smaller without the constant noise of his routines. Some spoke as if expecting me to feel sorry, others as if they were proud I had finally stood up for myself. I didn't correct any of them. I had stopped living for other people's interpretations. The truth was, my father's stroke didn't erase the years behind us, and it didn't undo the bruises or the words or the long stretches of silence where love should have been. It was simply the end of one chapter and the start of another where he had no role in my decisions. I threw myself into work, taking on more cases, mentoring interns, and realizing that the calm I had cultivated under duress was now an asset in negotiations and client meetings. On weekends, I explored hobbies I had never dared to try, taking a pottery class where my lopsided bowls made me laugh, and a hiking group that introduced me to trails winding through forests I had only seen in pictures. The friends I made there became the kind of chosen family Marlene had talked about, people who showed up for birthdays and bad days alike. One autumn afternoon, I drove to the courthouse alone to file the last piece of paperwork finalizing the protective order renewal. As I walked out into the crisp air, I passed the bench where I had once sat shaking before the first hearing. I paused, hands in my coat pockets, and let the memory settle beside the reality of now. I had walked through fire to get here, and I had come out carrying only what I chose. That night, I stood at my apartment window watching the city lights flicker against the dark and felt a quiet satisfaction settle deep in my chest. It wasn't revenge that warmed me, though, seeing justice done had mattered. It was the knowledge that I had reclaimed the right to my own story and that no one, not my father, not my mother, not Angela, could take that from me again. There were still moments when the old echoes tried to creep back in, when a slammed door in a neighboring apartment made my shoulders tense, or when someone's tone in a meeting sharpened and I felt the reflex to shrink. But each time I reminded myself that I had already lived through the worst of it and walked away. The past could follow me only if I let it. Winter came, and with it a quiet holiday season. I didn't go back to my parents' house, didn't send gifts, didn't answer the obligatory family group text Angela tried to resurrect. Instead, I spent Christmas Eve at Marlene's helping her grandchildren frost sugar cookies and laughing when more sprinkles ended up on the floor than the cookies themselves. On New Year's Day, I drove out to a frozen lake with friends from the hiking group, the air sharp in my lungs and the sky an unbroken pale blue. We built a fire passed around thermoses of coffee, and I found myself telling a story from college that had nothing to do with pain or survival, just a memory of a good day. That felt like its own victory. The court-ordered payments arrived on schedule, a monthly reminder that accountability was possible, even in families where it had never existed before. I used part of it to enroll in a professional development course, something I had put off for years, and part to start a travel fund. I wanted to see places untouched by my history cities where no one knew my name, or my families where I could just be myself without the weight of old roles. In spring, I took my first solo trip to Seattle, wandering through Pike Place Market, tasting fresh cherries, listening to buskers on the pier. No one asked me to explain myself there. No one measured me against anyone else. I came home with a camera roll full of sunsets over the water and a certainty that this was only the beginning. One evening back in my apartment, I came across the box I had kept in the back of my closet, the one with the copies of court documents, photographs of bruises, and the thick folder of statements. For a moment, I considered throwing it away, but instead, I slid it onto the highest shelf. It wasn't a weight anymore, just a record, a proof to myself that I had done what needed to be done. The life I was building didn't erase what had happened, but it put it in its place behind me, where it could no longer decide who I was or where I was going. And as the sun dipped below the skyline that night, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, I understood that freedom was not a single moment in a courtroom or even the day they left my apartment for the last time. It was every choice I made after that to keep moving forward every step away from the shadows, and every day I woke up knowing I was no longer theirs to hurt.